Today, I want to look at where we might discover the answers. And the theory that's floating around now in most academic circles is that there are answers to the four questions, which of course we saw last week were three questions. And where are the three answers? It's the three statements that Rabban Gamliel says that you're supposed to say at the Seder. So let's take a look at that. I'm bringing you from the Haggadah first. So this is what you would find if you opened up a traditional Haggadah. Rabban Gamliel Haya Omer. Rabban Gamliel used to say, which seems to imply that he would say it all the time. Like this is something that it was a statement of his. As we'll see, that's not necessarily how it's framed in the original source in the Mishnah, but let's just take a look at it. Whoever doesn't say these three things on Pesach hasn't fulfilled their obligation, and these are they, Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. Now, when we get to this point in Maggid, I'm always sort of thinking, like, if this is what we need to say, how come it took us so long to get here? And why haven't we said this up until now? But okay, let's say it. Otherwise, we haven't fulfilled our obligation. Sounds important. And then we get the sort of outline, the filling in of each of the three categories that Rabban Gamliel says we need to mention. Pesach, it seems to be that at least two of them are a play on words. Pesach, shayu avotenu ochlim bizman Beit HaMikdash hayat kayam. The Pesach that our ancestors used to eat when the Beit HaMikdash was standing. Why? Now that whole sort of side comment of this is the thing that we used to eat when the Beit HaMikdash was standing implies that the Pesach itself, the lamb, is not on the table. This is sort of like a memory that we have. We used to eat it. That's also not necessarily something that is in the original Rabban Gamliel. We'll look at that in a second. But then we'll see, okay, it's because Ashum shepasach HaKadosh Baruch Hu al batei avoteinu Mitzrayim, because God passed over. Why do we eat the Passover lamb? Because God passed over the houses while doing the plague of the firstborn. So that's sort of the Pesach one, which makes sense, and the play on words works in English and in Hebrew. Pesach and Pasach, Passover and Passover. And then we quote this verse from Shemot. Okay, let's take a look at matzah. Matzah zoshan ochlim al shuma, and this is following the order: Pesach, matzah, and maror. So we did Pesach. The sacrificial lamb that we used to eat, don't eat anymore. Now let's talk about matzah. Why do we eat it? Al shum, because our ancestors' dough was not able to rise right before they were redeemed. That's the sort of story that we tell about the matzah. The matzah was something that didn't even have time to rise before we got to be redeemed. And we quote another verse from chapter 12 in Exodus. Okay, so that's the explanation of the matzah. And then finally, maror. Why do we eat maror? Because shemerurum amitzrim et chayei avoteinu, because the Mitzrim embittered the lives of our ancestors in Egypt. And then we quote a verse that uses that language in Exodus chapter 1. Okay, so sounds good, right? Pesach, Matzah, and Maror, each of them have the explanation. Why are we doing them? Each of them have a verse associated with them. And it's just sort of free-floating towards the end of Maggid, not connected at all to our questions. Okay, but let's take a look at how this appears in the Mishnah. I'm scrolling on down. You remember that the Mishnah has three questions that we looked at last week. The first one is the dipping of the maror. We're used to dipping once. Why do we dip twice? The second dipping is the maror. So question number one is maror. Question number two is matzah. We can eat chametz and matzah the rest of the year. This year we only eat this night we only eat matzah. And the last question, it's not about leaning, and it's not about another dipping separate from maror. Our questions have essentially two ones about maror, one explicitly about maror, and one about the second dipping. But the third question is, why do we eat this meat only roasted and not prepared in another way, boiled or cooked in another way? Okay, those are the three questions, which if you were going to sum them up, they would be maror, matzah, and Pesach, right? So, which is the inverse of Pesach, matzah, and maror. Now, what happens next in the Mishnah? After the questions, we have this next instruction, Ulefi da'ato shel ben aviv melamdo, and according to the knowledge of the child, the father should instruct him. Okay, so that's the sort of They ask the questions. Again, who's asking the question? Not totally clear. See our discussion last week. But then the response seems to come through instruction. Now, the instruction here doesn't seem to be specifically oriented to answering the questions, and that's when we get to the instruction to go from degradation to praise. However, in the next Mishnah, we get the following statement from Rabban Gamliel. Rabban Gamliel Omer, Kol shelo amar shlosha devarim elu pesach lo yatsa yedei chobato, ve'elu hein, or in some versions that even that those two words are missing. Pesach, matzah, umerorim. Okay, so what do we have? Now we don't have Rabban Gamliel used to say, but rather Rabban Gamliel says, Rabban Gamliel Omer. Now, when you have in the Mishnah a statement, the rabbi's name followed by Omer, that is almost always a signifier for a debate, a machloket. In other words, there's a previous opinion A, and then Rabbi B says, which means he's disagreeing with the previous opinion, as opposed to Amar Rabban Gamliel, which would just be a statement. So when you have Rabban Gamliel Omer, he's disagreeing with something that comes before him. Now, what is he disagreeing with? And in fact, we see that the Rambam says, the halacha goes according, I'm commenting on this Mishnah, the halacha goes according to Rabban Gamliel. Oh, really? I didn't even know there was a disagreement. But now it's not just a random free-floating statement of Rabban Gamliel who says, you got to mention these three things, but rather you have to mention these three things as opposed to the previous opinion, which didn't seem to need you to specify these three things at all. In other words, it's possible that Rabban Gamliel is disagreeing with the anonymous Tanakama opinion that says Ulufi dato shel ben aviv melamdo. According to however the child can understand it, you instruct him, which seems to mean you figure out the right way to engage with the child and teach them this night. That's opinion number A. Whereas Rabban Gamliel is saying, no, that's actually not the way you relate to the questions. You have to answer the questions with a specific response, not whatever comes to you, not whatever's based on the child's level of understanding, but rather almost like a liturgical response. And here you can see a much shorter version of what we get in the Haggadah. Pesach, al shepasach hamakom al batei avoteinu Mitzrayim. Pesach, why are we doing the Pesach, which corresponds to why are we eating the meat only roasted tonight? Because God passed over our houses, the houses of our ancestors in Mitzrayim. Mirarim, why are we dipping twice? That corresponds to that question. Al shemeru ha-Mitzrim et chayei avotenu Mitzrayim, because the Mitzrim embittered the lives of our ancestors in Mitzrayim. And matzah, al shem shenigalu. And matzah is because we were redeemed. Without getting into any detail about how matzah represents redemption, maybe it's because we didn't have time to have the bread rise, but it doesn't actually specify it, and you actually don't get any wordplay here. It has been suggested over time that matzah and lehotzi are the wordplay that's sort of underneath this, right? Matzah, which is just a wordplay. It's not actually etymologically true. But what if matzah, which sounds like lehotzi, to take out? What if that was the wordplay we were doing? That you could certainly find a verse that in which God took us out. V'otanu hotzi misham, God took us out from there. So matzah is the wordplay waiting to happen, but we actually don't get that in this statement of Rabban Gamliel. Although we have wordplay with Pesach, we have wordplay with Maror, we don't get that with matzah. We just say matzah because we were redeemed, which actually gets to the larger question, which maybe we'll explore about: is matzah the bread of freedom and redemption? Or is matzah lechem oni, the poor man's bread? What is the matzah exactly here? But at least in Rabban Gamliel's presentation, matzah is the symbol of redemption. So Pesach is the symbol of being saved. We were spared the plague. Maror is the symbol of what we were embittered. Our lives were bitter before we were redeemed. And matzah is the moment of redemption. Now notice it's Pesach, matzah, mirorim. That's the list that Rabban Gamliel says. But then when he actually outlines it, Pesach, Mirorim, and Matzah, it's out of order, which is just interesting and surprising. Different theories about that. Maybe the list, Pesach, Matzah, Mirorim, was added later, and you go with sort of the shortest to the longest word. Doesn't totally make sense. If you only have three terms, how come they couldn't keep them in order here in the Mishnah? Again, in our Haggadah, it does go in order. But in the Mishnah, it doesn't seem to go in order. Perhaps because the next part of the Mishnah goes right into praising God for redeeming us. And then to that whole question that we looked at the very beginning of what does it mean to praise God for redeeming us? What's the right blessing to say around that first part of Hallel? And how do you say Goel Yisrael, God redeems Israel, or Gaal Yisrael, God redeemed Israel? Either way, matzah is the sort of final step towards redemption. And then the Mishnah will go and say, Lefikach, that's why, therefore, we have to praise and thank and all the praise words that we also say towards the end of Maggid here. Now you'll notice what's missing is that phrase Bechol Dor Vador, in every generation. We have to see ourselves as if we went out from Egypt, which seems to be a later addition to the Mishnah and to the Haggadah. But if you're just reading the straight Mishnah as it appeared originally, so a couple things to just review. Number one, Rabbi Gamliel is debating with a previous opinion. It seems like Rabbi Gamliel is saying, say this scripted response as opposed to say whatever response you need to say to meet the child where they are. I'm going to give you the scripted response, which is dealing with Pesach, Maror, and Matzah, the content of the three questions that were asked. I'm going to end with Matzah as opposed to Maror, because Matzah is the symbol of redemption. I'm going to go right on to the end of Maggid, which is the praise words in which we thank God for redeeming us, and we say therefore we have to praise God for redeeming us. So matzah is sort of the bridge that takes us from, oh, you asked these questions about these foods, let me explain the foods. I'm going to put matzah last because that ends us with redemption, which takes us right to the Hallel section of Maggid and the end of where we are for this section. Okay, so that's if you were imagining a world in which you ask questions, wouldn't you like them to be answered? Here are the answers. In fact, some even theorize that Rabbi Gamliel's three things appeared in our liturgy before the questions. In other words, maybe the questions were just put in there to prompt the answers, and the answers were already preset. But either way, Rabbi Gamliel is saying you can't just say whatever you want to say on Seder night. You have to say these three things because there needs to be a liturgical, sort of ritualized response to the questions that are being asked, and it's not just a free-for-all. So when we asked last week, was Mah Nishtanah a plan A or a plan B? Is that something you only say if no one asks a question? And now you're saying these answers. It could be that the whole question about what you're doing in Maggid is scripted versus non-scripted. You have a scripted approach, which is say these three questions and then say these three answers, according to Rabbi Gamliel, and it's a liturgical march through the evening. Or maybe you have say the three questions if you need to, but ideally ask any question you want and respond to the questions, whether the scripted or unscripted ones, with whatever you want to say. And those are two different approaches to how we might imagine Seder night. So Rabbi Gamliel is on team scripted, and the anonymous voice of the Mishnah is on team unscripted. We're going to look further into this as we move through the week, and wishing everybody a Yom Tov.